Parrot TV, the voice for humanity.
Hi, welcome to the New York Parrot Literary Corner, the best and only TV station globally for voices and creative minds out there. So if you guys got a creative mind, come and get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Today we have Deborah Turner, who comes from a long line of tall women. Her debut book, Sweating It Out, of sports poetry emerges in part from how coaches quickly spotted and recruited her for basketball, rowing, softball, and track. She played the prior two in college, where she remained long enough to earn degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Michigan, and a doctorate in information library studies from the University of Washington. She also served as a Fulbright Fellow in Tampere, Finland. Although Turner has worked as a librarian, an educator, and a researcher, she now writes poetry and prose full-time in Philadelphia. The opening poem of her debut book, Juneteen, earned a Pushcart Prize nomination. Her early works appear in the Lavender Reader, as well as in anthologies, including The Body Eclectic and Letters to My Sister. Additionally, she blog publishes on her website. Turner now lives with her family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and you can visit her website at www.deborahturner.online. Thanks for joining us today, Deborah. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Dustin. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So I'm curious about your book, Sweating It Out. What is the, what can sports poetry say that other mediums can't about sports in life? And what is the premise of the book? It's it's obviously described as sports poetry. So what is that exactly?
Sure, it's sports poetry. So it takes sports and play as a theme. So whether it's formal organized sports or just kids around the block playing around, but it also there's some wordplay in it as well, of course, because it's poetry. So in that way, that theme emerges as this book of jock poetry. And for me, Sweating It Out really is the perfect title because it talks about how we sweat it out, not just when we play and in sports and on and off courts, but how we engage in life, whether it's professionally, whether it's personally, whether it's our health-wise as we get older, just other things with our all sorts of things, our families, especially a lot of blended families out there now. And so Sweating It Out really just is that effort, that product of engagement, I guess is a way to put that.
It's a very useful metaphor for life in general. I mean, we always talk about, we use the phrases, don't sweat the small stuff. There's all kinds of interesting little, sweaty allusions to sweat in our culture. And so, sweating it out could be just bearing with it, or just playing it out, playing games and getting your energies out and having a good time and so forth. It can kind of be, I guess you could say, it can be like a dual metaphor.
Yeah, so and also I'd add to what you said, I'd add taking it seriously. So
yes. It's very kind of a dualistic mindset going there. It's like a twofold nature of the word. So I'm curious, you also have the memoir that you're working on. So is there any interesting stories from the memoir that you could share without giving away the premise or the general idea of the book, so people will actually be willing to buy it? Maybe give them a little teaser to what we could have.
It is a teaser, partly because I'm still working on it. Really, it's in rough draft form as a manuscript, and I put it aside a little bit as to deal with my Sweating It Out as it came out and marketing it and between readings and whatnot. But my memoir, it really comes from a period of my life where I was in the academy in tenure track position and trying to after getting my doctorate. And I moved to Philadelphia, and it was the first really urban place I lived in. And I also lived in West Philadelphia, which is a really vibrant community that has a rich history. Mainly demographic is Black American, a lot of poverty, a lot of homelessness, drugs, just problems that come with poverty. So one story from the book that I find rather poignant comes from a winter day. And in Philadelphia, we get all seasons, including the snow season, I like to call it, having come from the southern part of the country, in southern states, especially in California, Florida, Georgia. So I wasn't really someone who grew up learning how to shovel snow. And so I shovel snow by the waiting game, like, okay, the sun's going to come out, maybe it'll melt enough, and then I won't have to shovel it all. And I just take forever to shovel. I can go out and work on a sidewalk for an hour, and a native will come out and in like 5 minutes do what I couldn't do. So one particular day I had to use my car, which I don't use a lot. I'm more of a cyclist. There, the jock poetry. My car was encased in snow that it snowed, it had melted a little bit, it had iced over, and it just, it had to be chipped out and shoveled out. So it was just a really big job, and I couldn't even open the door. It was shoveled in so hard. These number of young men, about 5 or 6 young men, came walking down the street. And I haven't lived in a city before, but I've been in cities before. I have a sense of street smart and how to just engage. And I just sort of, I wasn't overly concerned for my safety, but I just felt more aware of my surroundings than I had when the street had just been empty a few moments before. And some of their behavior and just my past experiences led me to be that careful and to become that street aware. And where I might have thought, I might have just sort of braced myself for sexual harassment, catcalling, or just anything. Instead, I got one of the gentlemen attempting to take my shovel. And I slowly realized they wanted to help me get the car out, because for them it was just a game. They were trying to engage, and it's like, wow, this car is really in there. Let's see if we can get it out. So in the end, they ended up helping me. And it took a long time, like 20, 30 minutes, which is really unusual. I mean, that was a lot of snow. And so I thought, let me just pay for their next pizza or something. So I tried to give one of them money, and, and I was feeling so grateful. And I got what I didn't expect at all. I got a look of concern and almost offense. The person was offended, and he looked over to someone else in the group. And I slowly realized that that maybe this was a group involved in a gang. I didn't know, I couldn't tell, because I was used to the halls of academia. I was used to it's just a different life. And I couldn't understand them. They couldn't understand me, even though we were both speaking English. So I slowly realized that there was some hierarchy, and I should have offered the money to the leader and not to the one I did offer it to. And it was it was a sad moment. Like, I was happy I could use my car again, but I was also sad because I had messed them up. So in a nutshell, that's one of the stories from the memoir, which is really about the difference of living in a neighborhood that's going through changes, a lot of gentrification, which is happening in a lot of parts of the city, while I'm also experiencing tenure track in that, and just really trying to compare and make sense of both, because there's a lot of, believe it or not, similarities in those two contexts, even though I'm walking very different contexts. Yeah. Thanks for asking about my memoir. Huh?
It's absolutely, definitely, it's part of your creative work. So we would like to just a little bit about everything. So you also are working on a novel. So you've got multiple things you're juggling. You've got the novel Harvesting Her Own Cranberries. What is the story behind that title? It's an interesting title. Is there any story behind that?
There is quite a story behind it for me, and it's a story that doesn't really reflect the novel too much. But back in the old days, in waiting rooms, we had something called a magazine, and we picked one up.
Those are extinct.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And so back then, I came across an article about cranberry harvest, and it's just the cranberries float, and so based on that, there's a whole harvesting method that takes advantage of that leverages how cranberries float. And as I was reading through this article, which just wasn't in my world at all, not my fiance's family has a farm, a century-old farm, which she's visiting at this point in Missouri. There's a designation in the Midwest for families that have had a farm for 100 years, but that's not my background at all. So why was I reading this article? I don't know. I just found it fascinating. But as I finished it, I realized it reminded me of something. It reminded me of how I learned to do my own black natural hair, my nappy hair. And so at the time, I was taking a writing class with Ellen Bass, who's a poet on the West Coast in Santa Cruz, where I used to live. And we had a writing assignment, and just as like a prompt to go write. And I ended up writing something about this article, and was prompted by this article. And I waited until the absolute last, one to read their work, and I read it, and nobody said anything, which was unlike the reaction they had from all the other readings. And finally, Ellen said, "That's the start of a novel." I was like, no, I'm just doing my homework. I'm a poet. And she's like, no, that's the start of a novel. And, after this sort of 6th grade back and forth, years later, I actually have, now I'm working on the 5th draft of that novel. So it's interesting story.
Interesting. So yes, the word harvesting can mean so many different things. Like you harvested from a poem, the idea for a full novel. And that's fascinating. Is a lot of people wouldn't think of a poem, one poem becoming a novel. Like you said, it was like a 3-page poem, I believe, and it's that's fascinating. It's like you never know where the creative process will push you. So,
right.
quite
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, you don't.
So
And then,
yeah,
and then,
it's very unpredictable.
yeah, and the novel's actually about a mixed race little girl who goes missing, and it's about how all of her family gets engaged in trying to bring her back to safety.
Oh wow, okay. So
Yeah.
that gives a little bit of backstory behind it. So if anybody's interested, definitely when that comes out, keep a lookout for it. Harvesting Your Own Cranberries.
Thank you for that
So
positivity when it comes out.
when it comes out, it will. You'll get it. If
Thank
it's
you.
meant to be, it'll happen. It will come
Thank
out.
you.
Let's give you the high five on that one. So, another thing I'm curious, you've kind of moved around quite a bit and shifted here and there. You've been everywhere from Philadelphia to Berkeley to, Finland. So I'm curious, how the literary publics differ in each location, or is there a difference?
I love that question. For me, audience really feeds me and feeds my work. So I think about audience a lot, and I haven't had that question before, but when I think about it, the first thing that comes to my head is no. I think audience, wherever I go, they really want truth and something that they can relate to, and maybe even learn from. And I judge that by responses I've gotten, from applaud to comments to just interactions, discussions I've had with others I've shared a stage with. And so I think that if any similarity in the geography and the different geographical audiences, it's that. Certainly there are some cultural things, like Finnish people tend to be a little quieter in reading poetry.
Yeah.
And there's some places in the Black South where the call and response is just true, go girl,
Right.
You hear that. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So people differ from, a little bit in their reactions, not so much in what they expect or what topics they address, or so there's not a lot of difference amongst the I guess you would call the literati, as far as what they like to hear or what they don't want to hear. Is there like do you find maybe that they address social issues differently, or there may be different social issues altogether from, like, say, Finland to the American South? Or
I maybe if there's any difference, it's in the palette. For example, I've done a reading, queer reading called I forget the name, what it's called, but it's hosted at a place in Philadelphia called the Tattooed Mamas, which is great taco night, Taco Tuesdays. And it's a younger crowd, it's a hip crowd, a whole lot of ink, and tattoos. And I have a sex poem, for example, and I don't read the sex poem everywhere, but this crowd appreciated the sex poem,
at
right?
a church, maybe.
Right, exactly, yeah. So there's something about demographics, I think, where I might find similarities with folks who are working class, folks who are more social justice oriented, and versus folks who are more literary, the academic crowd. They might appreciate some of the more haikus that I've written, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So you kind of judge the audience, by maybe the crowd, and you can kind of get a feel for what they're about, and you kind of just judge, what you're going to read based on their what they would appreciate. Obviously, you wouldn't read something that they wouldn't appreciate, when you get up in the crowd. You just read something that's like not even in their taste or in their spectrum. That's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah,
Would
exactly.
you like to read a poem for us, give us a taste of what you're about and how you sweat it out yourself, maybe?
Yeah. And actually, I'll segue it with a little story about this poem from my first book, Sweating It Out. Here it is, right here.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll share a poem. So again, it's sports poetry, and this particular poem is about play and online gaming play. And I'll share a little story after I've read it. But
Okay.
it's called My Son's Avatar.
Hmm.
My Son's Avatar. I was surprised to see a pale hourglass of a girl in our living room. Her red pigtail bobbed as she attacked the wall with an axe. After her, a burly black boy's dreadlocks also bounced as he knocked down the door to the kitchen. Still later, a freckle-faced tattooed white kid, then a svelte black girl advanced through the rubble to fell the garage. In shambles, the remains on the screen resembled my son's room. As axes changed to M16s, I took solace at what superior focus my son had before he got killed, and at how, at least, he wasn't asking for money. And I tried to recall what a decade of burning bras and another of fighting to make our lives matter meant. Were we seeking this kind of choice? Is this what we meant when we wish they could stand in our shoes? Thank you.
So what is that one all about? That's interesting. It sounds like it's about I don't know, it didn't sound like so much like competitive sports as maybe like a video game or something. And it's those in some of the socio-political stuff and so forth. What is the story behind that?
Well, the story for me, I was watching my son, my fiance's son, choose avatars for this online gaming, and then the game is just violent, and I'm just, I try not to engage in violence and think of violence as entertainment. This is his world, young boys, and yet the avatars he's choosing just kind of blow me away. You think like the obvious, you choose like some muscle man, but no, every now and then he chooses like redheaded with pigtails, and like a midriff shirt and Daisy Duke kind of shorts, and I'm going, what? Just is this
Creative.
right? Yeah, this is modern times. Okay, I get it. And so it just made me question, like, we're out in the streets, we're fighting for justice. To what end? And is it? Can we count this as progress? And part of me is like, I think we can. And just to segue to your last question about demographics, I've lived most of my life in small university towns, but now I'm living in an urban town, and I actually wrote that here in Philadelphia. And I went back to one of my university towns and read that poem. And I later heard that some of the folks who helped organize the event where I read wondered if it was an appropriate poem to read. They wondered if it was a fitting, and this is an artist. Yeah, and and that poem makes me giggle actually, and it also makes me raise my eyebrows and think. But I think on the surface, I could see how that question might have arose, but
I think academics tend to be very, progressive minded, and they tend to think of life, I guess you could say life, society progressing steadily upward, and you're kind of questioning that, which is good. I think it's great. It's very much of a rebellious thing to kind of question the orthodoxy. I do it a lot myself. It gets me into trouble all the time. And then I can see some people saying like, what exactly are you saying there? I mean, but it's definitely worth asking, why any question should be off limits. It's more about knowledge and seeking and trying to understand things as they are. So why should anything be off limits?
Yeah, I agree with you, Dustin. And my hope is that was someone's initial reaction. And when they went home later that evening, they might have thought about it and come up with a different perspective. And sometimes I find it's interesting to engage in those discussions. And sometimes I find like, I'm just going to let you think about that.
Right. Silence is a defense, as a sort of just peacefully, let people think it through. Maybe their mind will tell them the truth eventually when they go through that gauntlet of ideas about what was she trying to say exactly?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So thing I'm curious about, and this is a very timely subject, you have your Pushcart Prize nominated poem, Juneteenth.
Yeah.
So we have that coming up tomorrow. I mean, we do have a global audience. So I was wondering if you could give us an idea, what is Juneteenth? What is it about? What does it celebrate? And then we can talk a little bit about the poem and maybe a little more in depth about the meaning of Juneteenth.
Uh-huh. Yeah, one of the things I like about poetry is that it allows me to bring words or